In the category of what in the hell is he doing, President Joe Biden has been, according to the Wall Street Journal, and actually Washington Post, New York Times are all reporting this, that he is authorizing Ukraine to use American long-range weapon systems to strike deep inside of Russia. Now, as you know, we've been talking for quite a long time that this is the potential escalation of this war into territory that it is not seen at all. And that one of the things that I had feared from the outset and thought maybe we had dodged a bullet with the elevation of Donald Trump as the next president, because he had been campaigning emphatically on a decision to bring the war to an end. I think many of the polls are going to show, and when they start doing an analysis of why this war was lost by Kamala Harris, they're going to see that one of the reasons was because Americans don't want another war, and they certainly don't want to take a risk of a war with Russia. Now, as I have told you since this issue first came up, really, especially back in September, but even before that, that the use of long-range weapons are not going to change the tactical outcome of this war. That is already decided. Ukraine has lost the war. There is no path even to hang on. Long ago, back in late 2022, they really lost any possibility of ever going on the offensive and driving Russia out, and that was exposed as being completely absent in 2023. By all rights and rationale and morality, we should have brought the war to an end even before the end of 2023, when it was clear that there was no more path even to hang on. And because Russia was in the process of ramping up its defense industrial base, it was bringing on lots of troops. It was recruiting, not forced mobilization, but recruiting tens of thousands of troops per month and growing the size of its armed forces to the point where now it's 500,000 larger than it was when they invaded into Ukraine back in February of 2022. So all of the signs were very clear and unambiguous that Ukraine had irrevocably lost the war, and the only thing that they could do now was delay the eventual outcome by continuing to fight a war that couldn't be won. And of course, all they can do is just get more of their territory lost, more of their cities destroyed, and more of their men killed. So when Donald Trump won this election, and one of his major planks, he was going to end the war in Ukraine in a day, as he said, then it looked like, okay, then we probably dodged a bullet, because the Biden administration, certainly in the last 70 some odd days, is not going to do anything to escalate the war. I mean, that would be ridiculous, and there'd be no upside in even trying to do that. Everything has been tried up to this point, and none of it worked, or so we thought. And then now here today, we have news just this afternoon. On a Sunday afternoon, the announcement is made that apparently he has given authorization to do this. Now, listen, let's talk about what this doesn't mean, first of all. Even if you used all of the long-range weapons we have, and we have a limited number of ATACMS, that's our long-range missile that we've given, or the British Storm Shadow, or even the German Taurus, if they should authorize that, and France has a long-range weapon of its own. Even if you said let's going to give them all that we have, that won't change the outcome of the war. If Russia did nothing in response and just weathered these and shot them down with their air defense and whatever got through, they just sucked up the pain, it's not going to change the outcome, because the Ukraine side is irrevocably lost, in addition to all the categories I just mentioned, in the manpower issue. They don't have enough men to fight, and what they have are grossly underprepared, untrained, and they just can't get them fast enough and get them trained in. They don't have the time to do that, so they keep throwing more men in increasingly smaller numbers into all of these battle areas, and they're continuing to just die in large numbers, and they're not accomplishing anything. You can see from some of our previous shows, I have very detailed chronicled the rapid and increasing pace of the Russian territorial acquisitions and the number of Ukraine soldiers that are dying. The end is coming. The Eastern Front is starting to buckle, and it may not be very much longer before there's finally a major breakthrough somewhere. It's already happening with a lot of territorial losses on the Ukraine side. I mean, we're literally watching the thing fall apart before our eyes. And in the Kursk area that Ukraine made this small penetration into Russian territory starting back in August of this summer, that also came to nothing, and it is also being squeezed into nothingness. So any rational person would come to that conclusion. But saying now, after you've lost the presidential election, that you're going to allow Ukraine to use these weapons is so irrational, because You can't win on the ground. It's not going to change anything. Well, then what is the purpose? What do you think is going to happen? Well, according to this Wall Street Journal report that I cited a minute ago, and some of these others that are coming out, allegedly what's being claimed by some of the administration officials, well, it's actually about North Korea, because we don't want North Korea to come in. According to President Biden himself, somewhere around 10,000 troops, North Korean troops, are in either in Russia or in the Kursk area and might be engaged in that. And then there was, let's see, let me pull this up on my screen right here. I actually just saw this a short time ago. Actually, the New York Post, not the New York Times, the New York Post is reporting that potentially 100,000 soldiers may come from North Korea to complete the devastation and just basically close that war out. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, it's plausible, but it's also, by my accounting, probably unnecessary. And unless Kim Jong-un himself wanted the troops to get some combat experience, which is very plausible, that would make some sense tactically. But of course, you also know that in recent days, the Russia and North Korea signed a formal defense pact that brought a lot of these things and the defense of one into, coming to the defense of the other in similar regards to the NATO Article 5 treaty. But you see that that's actually reported in that. And by the way, also on that, there was a very, very important minor part of that article, which seemed kind of minor, but let me scroll down and show you that back again, because according to this report here, let's see if I can find that here. In March, Ukraine's forces stood at an estimated 330,000. That is a shockingly low number, because remember, they were close to 1 million sometime late in 2022 when they did a lot of these mobilizations, and they had the army that they had. They called up the reserves. They claimed that they had somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million. Now it's 330,000. At the same time, Russia's force is expanding. Well, so if you can see that the war is going to be over, and I can graphically show you, and we could spend a whole show of me chronicling why these long-range missiles won't change the tide of the tactical battlefield, then you see all that. Why would you then take a risk? Because this has not come cost-free. We've actually had some people that, and I'll show you in just a second, talking about how, look, this has some potential downside of escalation risk from Russia. But David Sachs, who's a big supporter of Trump and somebody we've had on our show before here, went on and said, listen, he has a problem with this from a different perspective, because according to what he tweeted out this afternoon, President Trump won a clear mandate to end the war in Ukraine. So what does Biden do in his final 2 months in office? Massively escalate. It is going to hand Trump the worst possible situation. Now, that's if it only is complicated. But listen, this has some serious potential for escalation. I said at the top of the show, that's what worried me at the first of the war. And I thought we kind of had dodged a few bullets there too. Actually, nuclear missiles, I thought we had dodged. We've shown on this show how Jim Sciutto from CNN in his research found out that in 2022, there was a risk that Russia, fearing that they had lost a couple of big battles in Kherson, in the Kharkiv area, were giving serious consideration to using nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, to rectify the situation there. We had Bill Burns come on this year, the CIA director, and admit, yes, there was a risk of that then. And that's a relatively minor situation here. But now then, this situation here is much, much larger, because you're taking the chance that this actually, Putin makes good on some of his threats that could get us into war. And the I guess, strange thing, perverse thing, whatever you want to call it, Biden one time recognized the risk of escalation. Do you remember when he said this in early part of the war? I think it was March of 2022, when people were asking him if he should give the Ukrainian side, American tanks, planes, or whatever, maybe even bring our troops into the fight here to help the Ukraine side. Here's what he said back then.
We have a sacred obligation on NATO territory, a sacred obligation, Article 5, and we will not, although we will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine. Putin's war against Ukraine will never be a victory. Democrats are rising to meet the moment, rallying the world on the side of peace and security. We're showing the strength, and we'll never falter. But look, the idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews Just understand, and don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say. That's called World War III. Okay?
Okay, President. That was the risk of that. So now why at the end of your term, and listen, this really, aside from, I just told you all the tactical, even operational reasons why this won't make a difference. Well, then why would you want to take a risk after you now only have a couple of months left, a little over 2 months left? Where is the value in taking this escalation risk by saying, I'm going to help Ukraine? Well, okay, as I said earlier, the Wall Street Journal reported that the administration said, well, this is to deter North Korea from bringing in more of those troops, 100,000 by some accounts. That was less than a day ago. But how does he think that allowing long-range weapons to be used by Ukraine into Russia is going to deter North Korea from bringing in troops? I mean, where is the logic and the ration in that? I mean, I can see that that's an aspiration. It would be great to stop that. But folks, listen, man, I got to beat this horse until it's dead. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you bring in 10,000 North Korean troops. It doesn't matter if you bring in no North Korean troops. It doesn't matter. Russia has more than enough manpower, more than enough industrial capacity, more than enough ammo, weapons, and air power to win the war, and they are. Every single day, you see significant chunks now. This is no longer just these little incremental takes that they were doing before. Now that it's being chunks in several different areas of the Eastern Front. And it's inevitable that at some point there's going to be a break, a full-on break in the Ukrainian defensive line somewhere. So using these weapons is not going to deter that. And I fear, folks, I fear that they may mean this, that they may believe this, that they may think that taking this action will accomplish this objective to keep North Korean troops out. But so what? So what if you accomplish it? What if it did work? Then it doesn't change the outcome. But what it does is that for this infinitesimally small possibility of a reward, there is an enormous possibility of risk. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. But first of all, I want to remind you that Putin has been unambiguous. As recently as yesterday, he continues to talk about they're still willing to talk. After Trump come in, we showed you last week a video clip that where Trump said that he wants to talk to Putin. Putin said, I'm willing to listen. And this is the last deal. Let me remind you, this is back in June. This is the last time Putin said, this is through a translator. He said, here's what I'm offering on the table to have a negotiated end of this war.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Now listen, compared to the deal that was offered in Istanbul in March, April of 2022, that's a lot worse deal for Ukraine. There's no doctoring that up. There's no making that look pretty. That says that the territory where the current line of contact is in those 4 oblasts that Russia has annexed, the Ukraine side still has some of the territory in Zaporizhia, especially, and in that other province in the south. I can't recall which one right off the top. But they still have part of that still under their control. And Russia is saying for there to be peace, you got to leave it. We're not even that we're going to conquer it, but not even the current line. You got to give up territory that you currently have, even more of it. That's a terrible thing. I mean, man, I can imagine anyone in Ukraine would hate that. Everyone in the West would hate that. But I'll tell you what they should hate more is ignoring the reality and letting that Russian juggernaut continue moving to the West, picking up speed until it may take even more territory. We had Colonel Jacques Beau, former NATO officer from Sweden, on our show a couple of days ago, and he had this incredible graphic that he had put together to where he showed the map of Ukraine at various points from 2014 all the way up to a couple of projected ones that could be up to date. And every time the West has refused to negotiate, Ukraine gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And he said, and I certainly agreed, on our show that if you don't make these deals now, and he put one of them had the June 2024 options that I just mentioned on there. They showed what that looked like on a map. If you reject that, then the likelihood I would even go so far as to say the certainty is that an eventual negotiation is going to be far less territory. One of those last 2 or 3 that he had on the map, which has a bunch of red creeping up on the in what's currently Ukrainian territory, not just the area in Zaporizhia and Kherson, that was the other province in the south, not just that rest of those territories, but even more of that, possibly even taking Odessa, the city on the Black Sea, possibly taking Kharkiv, maybe going all the way up to the Dnieper River. Those are within Russia's capabilities. They do have the military and the wherewithal and the capacity to get to that, even if it takes them many more months, assuming that the Ukraine army doesn't collapse. There is no rational reason to think that we're going to ever get a better deal than what the one I just showed you that Putin offered up in there. But there is reason to worry that things could get a lot worse. So back in September, let me pull this up here. This is something that Putin said the last time that he was specifically asked what would happen if the U.S. used long-range missiles. It was theoretical at that point, but now it's actually happened. Here's what he said.
Решение о том, что страны НАТО напрямую участвуют в военном конфликте или нет. Если это решение будет принято, это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине. Это их прямое участие. И это уже, конечно, существенным образом меняет саму суть, саму природу конфликта. Это будет означать, что страны НАТО, США, европейские страны воюют с Россией. А если это так, то, имея в виду изменение самой сути этого конфликта, мы будем принимать соответствующие решения, исходя из тех угроз, которые нам будут создавать.
So you see it straight from his mouth right there. He's not beating around the bush. He's saying we will regard that as the direct participation of the United States. Now, there are many in the U.S., and I'm sure there are many on the Biden administration, and I know there are all kinds of pundits in the U.S. that said they don't mean that. They're just bluffing like they did on all those other red lines. How many red lines did we have? And we crossed them all. No tanks, no armor personnel carriers, no HIMARS kind of things. And all those things we brought in, even F-16s, and there was never any response. Well, here's the problem. We're the ones that said that was a Russian red line. Russia never said it was a red line. They said it would be a dangerous escalation and left it at that. And then they took some appropriate countermeasures. But you remember what happened? We said F-16s, that's going to change the course of the war. That's going to make a big difference in there. You get these modern. Did anything happen? We brought the F-16s in. What happened? You never hear about them again. Remember, originally HIMARS was going to be a game changer, and then ATACMS was going to be a game changer, and then it was the F-16s. Folks, there is no game changer. The game has continued on methodically from the east to the west, and that is going to continue on, except one difference in this case is this time Russia did make a red line. This time, Vladimir Putin did say, if you do this, then we will regard it as this and take appropriate countermeasures. Now, if anyone thinks that Putin is kidding on this, that he's going to allow long-range weapons by the United States, which he is correct, must be actioned by American troops. Those things are too sophisticated, and you cannot just hand a missile to the Ukraine side and say, do whatever you want with it, and then say, all right, there's a degree of separation, so they're good to go, because they can't do it. They can't operate these things. They're way too sophisticated in their telemetry data, in the tracking system, the targeting systems, and the flight controls. All of those things have to have expertise that they don't have. Ergo, we will provide it. So even if magically somehow we did train them to do that, it doesn't matter, because it matters what Russia thinks. And if Russia believes that it would be Western involvement, then they will take action. And he's had a long time to think about this. And listen, he doesn't want to escalate the war. That's why he keeps saying he's willing to have a negotiated settlement. That's why he's saying to Donald Trump, I'm willing to listen to you. I will definitely talk. We'll see if we can come to an arrangement, because that's in his interest to do so. It's unambiguously. It's never said anything besides that. This myth, this absurd, this perversion of a claim by the West, so many of these experts, so-called, that we put on our show here that claim, oh, Russia's going to keep going. They're going to go all the way into Poland and into the Baltics, is nonsense. They don't have the force structure to it. Even if Putin wanted to do that, they have all these extra troops, and you see it's still a pretty slow grind just in eastern Ukraine. They don't have the capacity to go into the West where we have, a whole 32 nation alliance, and we do have air power and we do have air defense. Even though it's not as strong as people say, it's a whole lot better than what the Ukraine side has. And Putin has no interest in doing that. There's no value to Russia. There is value in this part because they can get security. So taking the morality out of it, Russia has an incentive and they have the capacity to reestablish security on what is their western flank. But they don't have the capacity to go on any kind of a conquering deal. They simply don't have the troops. They would need millions of troops to even think about embarking on something like that, and they don't have it. So again, I keep coming back to this because it's the rational thing to do. We can find a negotiated settlement, get this negative thing off the table, end the risk of escalation. That still is a possibility. And I just pray to God that Ukraine doesn't get these weapons that has been allowed and then does strike something difficult and painful inside of Russia. Because if that happens, then we are at a literal coin flip risk of escalation. Because there's been a lot of traffic on some of these Russian Telegram channels. I don't pretend that these are official in any regard, but some of them have been right on some key issues over the years that I've been following this stuff. And some of them say that Russia has already made the decision, their general staff, that they think that the time of being pushed has come to an end. And if the long-range missiles are used, and if that red line is crossed, then Putin will authorize striking American or Western targets outside of the Ukraine, which could mean into Poland, into Slovakia, into Romania, some of the other places where there are concentrations of forces, possibly even into Germany, or especially if German Taurus missiles are used, or British Storm Shadow missiles are used, possibly even into UK. They have the capacity to do that. Now, all the pundits on the U.S. side say, they'll never do that. That's ridiculous. They're not going to start a war. Well, it's only ridiculous because you don't want them to do it. Because just imagine if say, some of these drug cartels, and by the way, you may have seen some news a couple of days ago that the U.S. has been helping, I think it was Mexico, attack some of these drug cartels. We were participating in attacking targets inside of Mexico. Now, imagine if Russia says, you know what? Hey, cartel, I got some long-range missiles. I got some Iskander missiles we'll give you. You can use to strike back at the Americans from Mexican territory where you're at. Now, how many of you think, by show of hands, I can see through your screens here, raise your hand if you think that the United States would say, that would go, you know what, if Russia does that and they give missiles to Mexican cartels and they strike and destroy and kill American troops on our ground, that we're going to say, well, I mean, it's only fair. I mean, we do the same thing to them all the time. So unfortunately, that's just a collateral damage. How many of you, I don't see any hands. Yeah, no, don't see any hands at all out there. I mean, you see how absurd that is. I mean, people would be losing their brains. They would be looking for retaliation the same night against Russia. And you somehow think that the reverse isn't also true, that we should give long-range weapons to somebody who's fighting a conflict with Russia, and that they would use American know-how, capability, and technical support to hit and destroy targets inside of Russia, and that Russia would do nothing about it because they know what it would mean. What if they do know what it means? What if they have calculated the cost that it would become and calculate and have decided the political decision that that impact and that result is necessary to assure their long-term security, and that they are already willing to pay that price because they may calculate the West is not. It's one thing to go on braggadocious on some American television network or go on Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times and brag about how confident you are that they wouldn't do it because you're tough and you know what would come in response. It's easy to do that when you don't ever have to make good on it. But I assure you, when you may recall earlier this summer, John Bolton famously said Putin would never use nuclear weapons because he knows that would be signing his own death warrant if it happens. Oblivious to the fact that if we ended Putin's life with a nuclear missile, that 10 nuclear missiles would be coming back in response. And it would be probably the United States, possibly even our own president, that would pay that ultimate price. Now, it's one thing to be cocky and talking about something you'll never have to do. But if those first missiles fly because someone finally calls your bluff, now then we're going to be in a horrific situation. Either you make good on this threat and then you do escalate that could then directly participate a war between the United States and Russia and NATO and Russia, or we back down and do what's sane and rational. And I will go on the record right here as saying, in the event that that happened, I would still say we need to stand down and to not retaliate and get into a nuclear war that we cannot win, as embarrassed as we would be, as humiliated as we would be, because then we preserve our lives. We preserve ourselves. But don't get to that point. We should never get to the point that we're even talking about risking nuclear war with anyone, much less Russia, who has a much bigger nuclear stockpile than we do. And folks, do you think that China would be upset about this? They would be loving it, because Russia is their ally, because they know Russia would probably weather a lot of this stuff, but they would see that we would, by our own stupidity, take ourselves off the board, take ourselves out of the equation. Now, of course, that would have catastrophic events for the global economy, but I promise you that China has been diversifying a lot already, BRICS, but even domestically, I think that they could handle a big shock to their economy by all the loss that they get to and from the U.S. economy in selling exports and imports, which would be devastating. But then they could recover from that. We will never recover from this. So China, in the long term, and the Chinese think long term, probably would not raise a hand against that. Now, they would publicly, of course, because they are always saying they want peace and the nuclear war would be catastrophic for everyone. And it's also true that they would get a lot of the fallout because you can't contain that. So it would be bad for that. But the biggest issue is they're thinking those things. I'm thinking things like this, and I know others in America are. I've been texting back and forth with some of them tonight, and I'm grateful that at some of the highest levels of our own government, there are rational people, and they are alarmed by this. We need to make sure that the people right now who have the decision-making power wake the hell up while it's still time to do something that makes sense, that's rational. Because if we keep going down this road, folks, if this is not just a report, but true in fact, and if Ukraine is ready, because let me say one last thing here about Ukraine. They don't give a damn if this escalates into a war between Russia and the United States. As a matter of fact, that almost certainly is Zelensky's desire. He wants to draw the U.S. and NATO into this war because he does know what I told you at the outset. He sees the battle maps. He knows the personnel and the imbalances that he can never overcome. And the only chance he has is either to make a negotiated settlement, and as I've told you before, which he may not survive that if he moves in that direction, or he gets the whole West to come in on his side and fights the war, and then Russia wouldn't pay much attention to Ukraine. They'd have this bigger wars to fight here. That's what he wants. We can't give it to him. There is no upside to this. Hear me clearly, folks. There is no upside, even potential for the United States. There's no upside potential for Ukraine to allow long-range weapons, American long-range weapons, to strike deep into Russia. There is enormous consequence and potential catastrophic risk if we do so. If we don't do this, then we can get to the end of the Biden administration, and then the Trump can come in and actually have a chance to get this negotiated and off the table. Though, as I've told you in previous recent shows, that's going to be a lot harder than Trump thinks, I think. But it's at least we're moving in the right direction. But if we go down this path, probably the best that we can get, if those long-range weapons are used, is that we just have to hope that Putin continues to self-deter and that he decides it's in Russia's interest to get to negotiation with the Trump administration. Because if he doesn't, if he calculates that Trump is not going to be able to make good on that, or that it's not going to matter, then we have the whole escalation risk, and God help us all if we get to that point. Listen, I don't know how this is going to go. This is all brand new right here. I'm going to continue to plow some of the sources that I have to find out what's going on inside the Biden administration, what people in the incoming Trump administration are saying, and hopefully they'll be able to bring some pressure to bear. We know David Sachs, who is a good friend of Donald Trump's and was instrumental in his campaign, and I know has helped get a lot of good people into the Trump administration. I bet he'll be bringing his influence to bear to try and get their sources to influence the Biden administration to get this idea off the table, and let's let it be a trial balloon that went over like a lead balloon, and to get those off the table so it doesn't happen. Let's hope that happens, but we'll stay on top of this for you, and I'll continue to give you updates every chance I get. Thanks very much, and we'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.